This time, Defend Rural America has gathered support across the state. And it's an honor to have Kirk MacKenzie here tonight. Please make welcome.
Thank you, Wayne. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I'm going to try and avoid getting too much noise out here tonight. The title here, I think, really is the issue. We have fundamental changes going on that's really opposed to what this country was founded to be. And I think we have to make some decisions here. I think the people need to participate in that process, and I don't think they are. Both because they're not allowed to participate, as they should, and I don't think we're necessarily getting enough people to participate. I want to thank Wendy and Kevin and others for putting this event together. I think we appreciate it. We are doing these kinds of training sessions across the state of California, starting in Oregon and shortly in Montana, so I'll talk more about that. The presentation tonight is going to be broken into three general categories: problems, causes, and solutions. Now here are some of the problems that I see. Now, I was born in Pocatello, Idaho. My father is an Air Force colonel, so I grew up traveling around a lot, and I ended up in the San Francisco Bay Area. But my heart kind of is still in the Rocky Mountain States, and I love it. I love the outdoors. And when I went to Siskiyou County, I did a documentary video. I interviewed 43 people in Siskiyou County, and it was a profound awakening for me that there is a crisis, and how far things have gotten off the track from when I remember them as a kid. My fondest memories are with my grandmother up in the cabin she had outside of West Yellowstone, and we would meet forest rangers all the time, and people, and that was a cooperative kind of relationship. So in that period of time, since then, here's what I see happening to rural America. Let's talk about water. That San Joaquin Valley Delta Smelt, the water is being shut down to agriculture. It went from 100% allocation to 80% to 60% to 40%, but they're still requiring the farmers there to pay for 100% of that water. And this was the news that came out this year. Because 300 of these 3-inch smelt were found in the pumps, they shut the water off 100%. There was no water going to a lot of those areas. 800,000 acre-feet of water were turned off. That's enough to give water for 800,000 families, irrigate 200,000 acres, produce 20 million tons of grapes, and thousands of jobs. This was a photograph of the Central Valley, and you can see that the orchards there are dead. This has become Death Valley. This was a picture that my wife and I took when we were on a recent trip. We've driven 8,000 miles in the last 2 months, just to tell you what we were doing. That is an orchard right off I-5, and that is completely dead trees. Those are dead. They are completely desiccated dry. I mean, just like if you go into a hobby store and you get dried flowers for a bouquet. These are absolutely they're sitting there completely dead. And we saw more, by the way, on the way up here today. What I see is because this water is destruction of trees, orchards, businesses, jobs, property values, and food. If we take a look at dams, this is a dam up at Flathead Lake up in Montana, where my wife and I go every year. I think the dams, I've learned to love them more and more. And they're being demolished. The proposal to blow up 4 hydroelectric dams on the Klamath Basin is the entire Klamath Basin. That's an area larger than the state of Maryland. It encompasses 9 counties, 5 in California and 4 in Oregon, and will involve the destruction of 4 of those hydroelectric dams. Excuse me, I'm sorry for coughing. It's going to destroy reservoirs, and for anybody who's lived in California a long time like I have, and you drive by a reservoir You know, reservoirs are very important to California, and yet they're being destroyed. You destroy a dam, you destroy a lake. You destroy the habitat that lake had, you bring back flooding and drought into the rivers, and of course in this case it was energy for 60,000 homes. The way they're going to change this is the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, and I see this being repeated in other places in the country. You have this idea of stakeholders. Stakeholders can be anybody, and they can be everywhere. They don't have to be people in the county. In fact, the stakeholder definition is really kind of contrary to constituents. It says anybody can get the vote on what you do with your land. People in New York City, Washington, D.C., whatever. There's a group of people, government agencies, special interest groups, they get together and they say, well, we're going to manage that state of Maryland, all the resources. And they go to the federal government to try and get a charter. Now, should they succeed, then what happens is you don't need your local government. You might as well fire the counties and your city because of basically your decisions that are going to affect your lives and your properties and your incomes are going to be made by remote control. And the word for that is governance. In this cohesion, the local people don't matter, local government doesn't matter. This is another dam, the CONDIT dam, and unfortunately the sound is not working here on my computer, but I'll show you the video. This is what's going on. You can see all that silt flowing into the river. Now when that's completed, that's what it looks like. You're seeing the destruction of the lake and all the habitat. You see the destruction of the riparian habitat along the sides. You see a bunch of mud. How would you like to have that property? Not only is your property now worthless, completely worthless, you are now in violation of federal laws that say that you can't have banks like this because it will slough off. It has nothing to do with you, of course, but you're now in violation. There is an agenda here. There's over 1,000 dams at last count that have been destroyed, and this is actually a website tracking the destruction of these dams with the goal being to do so. And I think they're now talking about the Columbia River dams, and there's even some discussion of some of these really big dams that are on the horizon now. This is the state of Montana, where my wife and I returned from a little 5,200-mile jaunt. The entire western watershed is now under attack. It affects 11 counties, and an argument that senior water rates that go back to the 1800s, and all the in-stream flows. And what they're saying is the Flathead Indians now have low senior water rights. Now, Flathead Indians have a very small portion around here around Flathead Lake. And the interpretation now is that because they have fishing rights, that means that they have therefore control over all the water flowing into Flathead Lake, which means the entire western watershed. Likewise, just like the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, they're talking about, quote, a water compact, which they're looking for government approval, which will remove all the water rights of people that have these for 5-6 generations and revert back to the Flathead Indians. This is one, the White River Watershed Blueway. It's a plan to take over, under the name of water, an area that's about a third of the size of Missouri, which is on top of blue, and Arkansas below, which is kind of a tan color. And you can see in the darkened area in the middle what the impact will be. And it's important to notice because there are some proposed solutions. And one of those is called statehood, like Utah is doing. This is a state that has nothing to do with quote unquote federal lands. This is all private land we're talking about here. Jurisdiction, and I'll come back to that, is the key. Agriculture. This is one of the things that Montana studied. They would like to restore the buffalo Sunset Magazine, June 2013, where they're purchasing land as fast as they can to take it out of agriculture. They purchased 300,000 acres so far, and this article indicates that we want 3 million acres in order to support 250 buffalo. The forest, and Steve is here. Steve, I took your pictures. They're becoming overly densified versus what they should be, which is nice and open. And this is an example of what happens when the trees are open. That's actually a forest fire that's begun, but because it doesn't have any fuel down there, the trees are far apart, the canopy is not closed over, it's not jumping up in the canopy and becoming a catastrophic fire. In fact, I think Steve's indicated to me that ran about 100 yards and went out all by itself. This is the kind of fires that we have, and I believe that all the western states in the last 10 years have seen the worst fire in their histories, in recorded histories. These fires reach 2,000 degrees. They absolutely burn the ground, and they can actually sanitize or destroy it if they get even several feet into the ground, and they miles an hour. The intensity of these fires is becoming overwhelming as a result of the overdensification of the trees, and these fires can generate their own weather. This is one in South Lake Tahoe. And you've had the rim fire here recently, so you know what forest fires do. My wife and I happened to be in Prescott, Arizona the day that the 19 hotshots died fighting together another fire. They're causing these forest fires, in addition to all this destruction, they're causing lives. Destruction of property, the absolute incineration of animals. Now, actually, during our trip to Montana, we went to that spot. I've seen that spot. Thank you very much. And they estimate there's about 3 animals, major animals per acre. So when you have, say, a 500,000 acre fire here, you're talking about 1.5 million animals, chipmunks, deer, elk, bear, coyotes, wolves, spotted owls, that are being burned alive. These incinerations are of high severity. Those fires are so strong that what's left over, 30% of that fire damaged area is dead, absolutely dead. The trees are just matchsticks, they're just charcoal standing up. Once that happens, then you get the water comes in, you get the mudslides that come on in. And here's a recent one. You may not realize that the flooding in Colorado was largely due to forest fires. And this is a quote taken out of this particular magazine. Quote, Boulder, Colorado is getting absolutely drenched. The downpour has caused flash floods throughout the Boulder area and killed 2 people. One factor has made the flooding considerably worse, the wildfires that have stricken the forest in the region in the past few years. Of course, all those muds go flowing into our rivers, which is a massive violation of the Clean Water Act. And of course, they produce some of the worst particulate matter that you could possibly imagine. You're talking about the 2.5 micron size particles that go in your lungs and never come out, just like the miners that mine in the coal mines. The pollution of the air quality, I believe, is just about as bad or worse than anything that man is doing. Massive violation of the Clean Air Act. And these forest fires, because the trees are so densified, are sucking up the water. And so you're seeing 30–40% reduction during the middle of the day in stream flows. The cumulative impact of that is about 1 to 2 million acre feet of water in California a year. Now remember I told you they released 800,000 acre feet to say the quote Delta Smelt. Well, they could have done the Delta Smelt and still had 1.2 million square feet for the 17 Valley agricultural production. But that water is both being sucked up by the trees, and the canopies are so dense that another problem that's occurring is when you get snowfall, it gets trapped up there and it evaporates before it ever comes to the ground as water. In terms of recreation, you know this, being so close to Yosemite, increasingly the so-called public lands are being shut off. You know, no hiking, no fishing, no hunting, no ATVing, no camping, all the things that we loved before are increasingly being tightly regulated or shut off completely and being turned into wilderness areas. All of a sudden we have a slew of designations, national parks, wilderness areas, wetlands, monuments, natural grasslands. Energy. In proven reserves in the United States, coal is producing 40% of our nation's energy. There's 486 billion short tons of coal. But that's being shut down by the clean air standards. Turns out standards have been set, and they had, I think they had like 10 or 20 years of meeting them, and they met them. It was painful, but they met them. In the Obama administration, they basically then upped them like 3 or 4 times and said you have 6 months to comply. They can't do it that fast, they don't have the money to do it. It's not economical. We have major coal facilities being shut down. Oil, including the Bakken oil fields, 1.442 trillion barrels of oil. Those are being shut down for lizards, buffalo, bugs, and grass. And all those listings are rushing forward in Texas and Oklahoma, shut down the oil fields there as well as the buffalo and grasses and so forth up in the Bakken oil fields up in Wyoming and Montana. Natural gas. We have 2.744 quadrillion cubic feet. Same thing is being shut down. We have hydropower, which I've come to appreciate. It's actually the only one of these energy sources that doesn't burn anything, so you get no emissions. It's absolutely clean. Water flows in and it flows out. It's renewable. We'll bring it back and it starts over again. It's clean, it's renewable, it's cheap. And it turns out that those particular generators are absolutely critical to the grid because electricity is delivered instantaneously. So the supply must always equal the demand. If not, you start to get phase and voltage variations at your end. You know what happens? Your clocks go crazy. Or what happens to industrial motors is they start really destroying things. So it turns out you go from 0 to 100% energy in a hydropower in 10 minutes. Whereas on a nuclear facility, you're talking weeks to bring it up. Hydropower is what balances the lines with the energy grid. Those are being destroyed. And in terms of nuclear, the North Arizona Strip is home to 40% of our uranium supplies, and those are being closed because of so-called listings. The solution of being told is solar. Now there's a solar farm. They're expensive. The fuel, the energy will cost us about 10 times. They're extremely inefficient. It takes 100 times more land to generate the same or even some less energy using this power as compared to a hydropower dam. They're very space consuming, as you can tell. And of course the impact the open space, the impact the watershed and the wetlands, the impact the habitat, the impact the bugs, lizards, and grass. There's no way you can deny that. Same thing with wind farms. Now I find it interesting that we're worried about freeway signs, and I've heard about, since I grew up as a boy, we don't want to have certain things on the hillsides and so forth because we don't want to obstruct our view. And yet all of a sudden we're basically saying this is the future. To me, that's about as ugly as Los Angeles. I mean, they're ugly. And they always seem to go exactly on top of hillsides and so forth where you really want to have a view. They kill eagles and other birds, which is a fact that's hidden. And of course, they have an impact. In terms of mining, there's a suction ridge mine. It's actually a much smaller thing. I never thought a suction ridge was. That's the motor at the end. It's got a little pipe goes down, it's like a gravel, goes over a sluice, and it goes right back again. These have been shut down illegally in violation of those miners' issued rights. So what I'm saying is that is this destruction, which means the expulsion of humans, human activities, and human improvements. I see an attack on our nation's prosperity because everything that we consider to be prosperous, is something physical. And it either comes from the ground, under the ground, is grown in the ground, or it's an animal running on the ground. That's it. And every one of those means of production is under attack. If I were to take out wood, and say, well, forget, we're not going to do the trees anymore. This podium would disappear, this would disappear, these walls would disappear, your clothes would disappear because a lot of the windows are the radon. If I took out mining, all the screws, the bolts, all the metal disappears. If we took all that away, we'd be standing here naked, sitting on grass and dirt. I mean, prosperity comes from these people in rural America, and yet they are all under attack, and it's happening nationwide. This is an agenda. We are in a crisis. What I see is reduced air quality, water quality, food quality, and in these communities that are directly impacted, which your county will be, more stress, more health problems, more spousal, child, and elderly abuse. In terms of your safety, there's more property damage, more drug cartels. When up in Josephine County, the economy has imploded so far that it's only Sheriff Bill Goodwardson and one deputy sheriff. That's it, cover a county of I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of acres. And it's a situation now that if they get involved in some kind of major crime, say murder, they can't do anything else. You get your house gets robbed, they can't, there's nobody there to come save you. The forests are absolutely taken over by the Mexican drug cartels. There's no repercussions. More substance abuse, more crime, and we reduce firefighting ability. In terms of welfare, I see it, fewer jobs, closing businesses. You go up to Siskiyou County, and they now have lost, they no longer have even one video rental store, that's gone. If you want groceries, you go 60 miles over to Grants Pass, Oregon, or someplace over there. Theater is shut down, a lot of restaurants are shut down. And this eventually hits the county budgets. So if we have the supervisors in the room, this eventually implodes your county budgets as well. And that means the services go down. You have less and more expensive energy. You have less access to and use of the natural resources and fewer children. The enrollment in these rural counties is going down because there's no future for the children. And more welfare and more dependence. In terms of the environment, this increased forest densification, forest fires, and I'm going to talk about desertification in a minute. At the same time, we have loss of our forests, incineration of animals, loss of habitat, loss of water, air quality, and they even willing to blow up fish hatcheries. I mean, this is, the argument to blow those 4 dams in the Klamath River is that Cocoa can't get up far enough up the river. Well, those dams are 200 miles from the ocean. 85% of the reproduction of salmon is within 25 miles of the coast. And these are waters that are too warm and too phosphorus-rich for salmon, but nonetheless they want to blow up these 4 dams. And when you blow up those dams, you also blow up the only fish hatcheries that are producing the salmon. 6 million salmon a year to produce them. In terms of recreation, more land closures, more national parks being closed off, wilderness areas, more monuments, grasslands, wetlands, more regulated access, more federal control, less public access, and less of all the things that we like about rural America. When we were driving back to California from Arizona after the one fire, we were trying to get out before they maybe shut down Prescott, if they never did, we were worried about that. We saw more fires, forest fires on the way home. And that all means closures. I think we have 2 visions going forward for the future not only of our country but of the world. One is the one the founding fathers had. It's based upon the American dream. And the American dream meant you were debt-free and you owned your 20 acres in your mule. You know, basically household ownership, home ownership. You were king of your castle. The other vision, in my opinion, despite all the words that sound so great, are actually very destructive. We believe in a constitution. I believe that the Constitution is largely being ignored and replaced. We believe in constituents, that people who live in your county should be the ones that decide what goes on in your county. They believe in stakeholders. When your endangered species listings, this frogs and toads listings, they get comments up on the website. Guess what? They don't ask you whether you come from this county. They don't ask you whether you come from the state of California. They don't ask you whether you're even from the United States. All you have to do is have a name and email address, and you get to submit commentary on what should be done in your county. People who've never been in your county, people who don't understand the problems in your county, they don't understand your love of the land. They're just sitting there getting their syrup up. I used to be a syrup supplier, I used to believe in it. And they see these things and they just click a button and say, oh, we don't want that to happen. And they count that as no, saying, oh, well, there's public support for this takeover of these forests. When in fact, that's not necessarily what you want to have out in people who live here. We believe in free will. Their view is central planning. Ours is government. Theirs is governments, which I'll talk more about. We believe in national sovereignty. There's another viewpoint that believes in independence. We believe in security. Their view is disarmament. We're losing this match. Rural America is failing. And I think that part of what I try to convey through pictures, including these pictures, is to make it visually aware. I want to go from your brain to your gut. Your county is going to fail if this continues. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. 30% of the nation's counties are now on the basis of financial collapse. 30% of the nation's counties. And almost every county that I go into, whether it's in Montana, it's in Oregon, or it's in California, I hear the same thing. Poverty, jobs are gone, people on the welfare, all these social problems arise. In fact, rural America is actually being conquered. So how come? Neo-Environmentalism. Now I call it Neo-Environmentalism because I think that we make a grave mistake. We tend to blame environmentalism. We say, those environmentalists. In reality, I don't know anybody that lives in rural America to become famous or get rich. It's a lifestyle decision. And I don't care whether you're a miner, you're farming, you're ranching. I think you love your nature. I think you love the land and you nurture your land. And there's some abuses, but I think for the most part that's really the true case. I think we have got to stop thinking that way. And let's label it what it is. These are neo-environmentalists. And you're the environmentalists. You are the stewards of the land. It's also crazy when you think this another way, because once you start contacting them, they get the white hat, because it's built into our religious background of our country that we believe to be good stewards of land. You put a white hat on their head, you put a black hat on yours. You can't win the debate, because you're the bad guy. And furthermore, you start thinking that you're not an environmentalist. You conceive as if somehow they are, the application you are. Stop it. Neo-environmentalism is a political movement. Now, I'm not referring to everybody that's as environmentalists, because I think that the true environmentalists of whatever political persuasion can come together, sit down, and truly look at what's going on and make logical decisions for what's best for our environment and our enjoyment of that, respecting the economies of these counties. Those people on both sides of that, they exist. It's not a question of left, right, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. It's a question of right and wrong. But there are, in this, people who are driving this. They're absolutely political. And I think they pump themselves in the ring. So I think it basically is environmentalists versus the political movement. It is the new Civil War. Neo-environmentalists are, in my opinion, domestic terrorists. What I showed you before, which is happening across the country, is more destruction that could be accomplished to our nation than the Soviet Union could have ever accomplished, even with nuclear weapons at its height. We're being destroyed from within. In fact, the Center for Biological Diversity, I think, took a map, strategically figured out where they wanted to get control of the natural resources of our country, and they filed hundreds of petitions for listings. They called it a writ of wits. The Spotted Owl listing that we're in the middle of right now, which is going to take over 2 million acres across 14 counties, is only the first of hundreds. They're not going to stop. They're already in the pipe. They are, in fact, in my opinion, these listings are new weapons of mass destruction. That includes legislation that's been taken to the extreme, legislation that was told to us and which I believe to be helpful. Clean air, I grew up in Pasadena, California, and if you want to rot the lungs out, you would have imagined those days when smog was so thick I could not see 100 yards. You start to breathe shallow. My dad would go fishing in Idaho every summer, and waders, rubber waders would corrode after 3 or 4 years. So, hey, I was there for the clean air. I'm there for the clean water act, you know? But it's gone beyond just being about the environment. The Endangered Species Act, as we've been told, it's about extinction, and it's about native species. This act was passed under the belief of the American eagle, which I now believe was a fraud, but be it as it may. We were believed that we're saving species from going into extinction, and we're talking about native species. That's really not what the Endangered Species Act is about at all. It's about geographic pockets. There are tons of coastal salmon. There are millions of them in Alaska because the ocean got a little warmer off of the coast of California and Oregon. They've migrated northward where the water is still cold. And that's because of El Nino. They're now they're spawning in Alaska. They go all the way across the ocean over to Japan, Korea, over there, and they've been successfully planted, for example, in the Great Lakes and reservoirs across the United States. There is no lack of coho. But they're saying, well, we don't think there's enough in the Klamath River Basin. Furthermore, they're no longer talking about species. They're talking about mutations of the species. They're changing the word species. Now, I'm old enough to know what species is. If two animals or two species get together and they mate and they have viable young, they're the same species. That's the definition. But what's happening today when you get a northern segment of the yellow-legged frog, we're not talking about mutations of frogs, we're talking about distinct segments geographically. So when you start looking at the adjectives that precede the word, you begin to see what's going on. Species, mutation, geographic area. The mutations are so small now that they consider them to be microscopic. They even consider them to be, well, you can't even see them, but something in the DNA is different. Now, if you look for that level of mutation, then I can guarantee you that blondes and brunettes are different species. Right? The Celtic people are different from the Mediterranean people, and blacks are different from white, but are we all different species? But that's the way that they're fooling us. I always thought it was about animals. Guess what? It includes bugs and grasses. I always thought it was about restoring the species. Do you know something? I first became aware of this in reading the EIS for the Klamath Basin, the environmental impact report statement. And it describes the objectives. There is not a single objective to restore the species. It's not there. The only thing that's there is habitat restoration. And what habitat restoration means, it sounds like a nice word, is the expulsion of humans and human activities. It is nothing more than land and resources grabbed. We thought it was about science. Turns out, we peeled back enough of these. I was involved in Drake's Bay Oyster Farm. I'm involved with Frogs and Toads, this Klamath River Basin, the Western Watershed in Montana. I've seen that they're not involved enough of these to see what's going on. It's not scientific data at all. They call it the best available science. They go out and somebody says, hey, we think this ought to be listed. They don't have to prove it. The government doesn't have to prove either. They go out and start looking on the internet and say, well, we see some data. A lot of this data is, none of it's measured. It's proxy data, some other data. Simulations in the computer. Now, I'm a computer industry guy, and I can tell you garbage in, garbage out. These simulations, they refuse to tell you what the algorithms, what the programming is, and they refuse to give you the data sets. But they say, well, we know, we predict. You would think that there would be some numbers that guide this decision making. What is it? You say there's too few. There's too few yellow belly fall. What does that mean? Have you heard any number? How many do we have? A million? 10? Nowhere in the endangered species listing proposal do you see any numbers whatsoever. And furthermore, there is no targets in the Endangered Species Act. When they vote those, we actually talk to the people in government, and they say, well, we vote those 4 dams, what's the target? They say, we've accomplished our goal as soon as the dam has been blown up. They don't care that the fish hatchery has been blown up. They don't care that 20 million cubic yards of sediment has been released in the river, and the coke will never come up the river again. They're accomplished the result. We believe it's native species being returned to the native lands. That's not true. The coho up in that basin are actually imported from areas outside. The wolf that's been restored, quote, that comes from Canada, has nothing to do with the gray wolf that used to be native. And furthermore, we discovered in the recent frogs and toads listing, guess what? The habitat designation, including your county, doesn't actually have to be where the species existed in the past. It doesn't have to be native. It just has to be habitat that's good habitat for frogs, including private property. We would think that they would include all the land, so that when they do frog and toad listing, that they would go ahead and say, okay, well, we have a monument over here, we have a wilderness over here, you know, national parks. We got it covered. We got enough of those yellow-legged frogs that are in here, that's it. We went to the meeting with Tom McClintock, which I helped set up, and guess what she said? We don't count those areas. Those don't count. Once they've been turned into that designation, then the next species listing by definition is looking for more land. It is, in fact, a hostile takeover, and the abolition of probably the federal rights. It's serial rape or serial plunder, one species at a time. The Equal Access to Justice Act, which was supposedly passed for good purposes to help small people sue the federal government and they get their legal fees back if they prevail, had some conditions in the law. You had to be a relatively small entity. You had to actually win in court, and the legal fees were capped at $125 an hour. Those are in the law, according to our phone. In practice, we have Sarah Club and other big law firms. Most of these, by the way, listings are coming from law firms. They're not like they're coming from, you know, Jane and John and Bill concerned about the land. They're coming from law firms who specialize in this. They're getting $650 an hour, and they don't have to win anymore. They just go ahead and threaten a lawsuit, the government caves, they settle, and they oftentimes keep those settlement agreements secret. You and I don't know what the settlement agreement is. This is actually a letter written from David Bitter, ranking member of the Committee on Environment and Public Works, John Boozman, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Wildlife, Jim Inhofe, who I met personally, by the way, good guy, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight, and Jeff Sessions, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Clean Air, requesting to see for them to get a copy of one of these settlement agreements because they're not even giving them the card machine. The second weapon of mass destruction is scientific fraud. I'm going to talk about in more detail on some of these cases. The yellow is the lake area that's now closed off from humans because of the spotted owl. And if you notice, it not only went up to northern California and Oregon, but it failed. So the solution was more land. The Endangered Species Act only has one solution. the expulsion of humans, that's it. Whether it's relevant or not, that's it. It now goes all the way up to the Canadian border. I think it's 50 some odd counties going up through California, Oregon. Nonetheless, it's still failing. Now, the whole argument is the spotted owl is in decline. Well, guess what? The spotted owl and the barred owl is doing quite well, thank you. They're the same species. They're the same species, longs and brunettes. And they, in the presence, the way you count spotted owls is you go out at night and you hoot. Now, wait a minute. You go out at night and hoot, and you listen to the owls that hoot back. In the presence of barred owls, spotted owls don't hoot. So furthermore, so you can't get them out of the count, and secondarily, they're intervening, so blondes and brunettes are producing redheads. Well, that's an endangerment, don't you understand the balance? So the solution is that they're killing the brunettes. They don't want to have the brunettes or the redheads. So now the latest wrinkle on this whole spotted owl is going out there and killing the barred owl, the same species, in order to make sure that there's enough spotted owl. By whatever criteria, who knows? According to Dr. Bob Zypak, same thing as I've already said, questionable science, computer simulations versus actual measurements, no correlation between owl populations and designated habitat. But the cost to the economies has been tens of billions of dollars. We're currently in the midst of this proposed listing of frogs and toads, and that's the part of geographic California that affects. So what you can see is that the Pacific coastal forests have been pretty much sealed off by the spotted owl. Now they're coming to the Sierra Nevadas. That's 14 counties that are going to be affected by the spotted frog and toad listing. 2+ million acres, 9 forests. It includes Yosemite. What's really going on is that there is a worldwide phenomenon that frogs are in decline, amphibians in general, largely because of a infection, a virus that's going around from an African frog that's immune to this virus that we brought in the United States for pregnancy testing. That's primarily what's going on. And although they have an antidote, they now know how to fight that virus. And how do you swab down all these frogs? The second one appears to be that they planted trout in the upper lakes. They're calling them non-native. There's debate about this, by the way. And there may be a good reason why they did that, not only for fishing, but for mosquitoes and infection would spread and those kind of things. Horseflies are terrible, but I don't know if you've ever been bitten by a horsefly, you know what I'm talking about. But in any case, that appears to be the primary reason. The solution has nothing to do with more habitat. But that's the only solution allowed by the Endangered Species Act. So they're saying they're in decline, bingo, Endangered Species Act, bingo, taking over more land. And I've already given you these revelations here about the way they count this. When they first put out the report, the proposed listing, they did not have any county level maps. So I submitted a request that I said, you can't get significant enough public comment. You can't meet NEPA. You'll violate NEPA if you don't provide us maps. They said, oh, you get these GIS files. It turned out to be quite expensive and complicated. So eventually came back and they did some. This happens to be Tuolumne County. And this area here, that's Yosemite. And you can see the impact this is going to have on Tuolumne County. Your county is going to be similar. Klamath dams, I've talked about enough because we're not endangered. We're still on scientific frog. I just want to talk about the dam destruction. 20 million cubic yards of sediment has built up behind those 4 dams since they were built in the last 100 years or so. Largely it's like a filter. So the higher velocity stream up above comes, it gets the reservoir, the water slows down, things start to filter out. And largely blue-green algae. 20 million cubic yards of prepared release is 1 foot deep on a 2-lane road for 1,600 miles, halfway across the country. That's how much sediment will be released. I worked with Drake's Bay Oyster Farm, which is a very popular business. It produces 40% of California special oysters, and they're beloved by the people in Marin County. Now, here's a liberal county. They're beloved by the county. This county prides itself on being involved in sustainable agriculture. And all of a sudden, they're being attacked. San Francisco restaurants love this business. They love the family. Dr. Corey Goodman happens to live there. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He is a wealthy venture capitalist, well-respected individual. And he went and actually looked at some of the data that was being used to why the oysters had to be taken out of the bay. And one of those scientific arguments was the oysters poop too much. I'm going to give you two quick examples of proxy data. They also claim that there's too much noise being generated by this business. And one of those was they have a little plastic pipe with holes of various sizes being turned by a 1.5 horsepower electric motor. The oysters go in, they spin on down, they drop out according to size. You cannot hear this thing above the background noise of more than 150 feet away. They claim you can hear it a mile and a half away. They also claim that when the boat makes too much noise, it disturbs the seals that breathe in this particular area about a mile and a half away. The boat has a 10 horsepower gas putt-putt engine, the kind that we used to have in my grandmother's canoe. Right? And they crawl along the bay in that. The data said that they're making so much noise that it's keeping the seals from recreating. The data they don't tell you is that the noise level we took was a military concrete steel mixer mixing rocks. And the data they took for the oil gas powered engine was a speedboat measured by the New Jersey police in New Jersey. They just grab data and they stick it into your, it looks like, oh, you presume they measured it. No, they just went out on the web and got it someplace. Now, we don't have the sound, so I won't be able to, you won't be able to hear this, but essentially, here is this respected scientist calling this scientific fraud. He doesn't mince words. I like this guy. That's at his home. On the Delta Smelt, this was an article, eventually the Delta Smelt, thing got in front of Judge Oliver Wagner, who had this to say about the government's witnesses. Quote, angered by testimony from the two scientists that he said was false, contradictory, and misleading. An attempt to mislead and to deceive the court into accepting not only it was not the best science, it's not science. Now, this is a judge, Steve. You don't hear judges speak out like this, but he was so irate at what he was being told in the intentional falsification. You're not going to be able to hear this one either, unfortunately. One of the myths going around is that cattle are bad. So everything possible is being done to eliminate cattle. Release bison, release wolves, release lions, anything and everything you can see of to attack cattle. If you go on the Defend Rural America website, there's a page on cattle where this guy, Dr. Alan Sager, gives a 22.5-minute presentation, which I cut down to 5 minutes. And here's the brief what he said. He had gone as a scientist to Africa to study desertification, the conversion of land into desert. And understand what was going on. And these are lands that get water during the year, but they would actually nonetheless die because they couldn't absorb the water and so forth. I'm going to stop this. And let's be the next slide. And what they did is the first project, these are large projects by the way, and there's some hectares, they're talking about millions of hectares. And what they did first was they concluded that man was the problem, right? So they expelled humans from these areas. the desertification continued. Then they did some more things, the desertification continued. And then finally they concluded it was the elephants were the problem because the elephants were stomping down the grasses. They were destroying the habitat. They slaughtered 40,000 elephants and found out they were wrong. What they found out instead, and what he did some experiments, is, and he basically makes the presentation that one of the greatest solutions to all of mankind's problems are cattle, bunched like they would be in the wild and moving, so they're stomping down the ground, eating the grass and pooping. And essentially it's telling you what cattle are nature's farmers. They're tilling the soil, they're fertilizing it, and they're eating they're harvesting the crop, which has to happen. In order for grasslands to continue to be healthy, you have to get rid of this year's grass growth so the next year's grass growth will happen. You've got to break up the crusty soil so a lot of will get in instead of just rushing on down. And what he did is some experiments, and they are night and day different. He shows areas that are absolute desert. They put the cattle in there, they run them through, and in a year or two, they're absolutely lush and green and water flowing. It's unbelievable. He's done it in many, many situations now. And he also says that the other solution they had to get rid of the annual growth was to burn the grass. But a hectare produces as much and worse emissions than 6,000 cars. He says cattle is the solution and the only solution. Great presentation. The sage grouse is now another listing. And here's what Pick and Shovel Gazette has to say. The main threats to sage grouse were not humans or surface disturbance brought on by prospectors, but instead cheatgrass and wildfires. Wildfires again. The third most detrimental threat is predators, namely ravens, coyotes, and badgers. And this is based upon 30 years of field research by Dr. Wayne Burkhardt, Professor Emeritus, University of Valparaiso. Real data. Nonetheless, they're going to invoke the Endangered Species Act. This will shut down more grasslands across 10 states. It's absolutely devastating. And by the way, why 10 states? I mean, if we're trying to save the extinction, why not 100 acres? The third, governments and central planning and planning agencies. I'm going to talk more about governments. Agencies, I'm going to skip over, you understand that one. Agencies are basically, they're stepping in place across the go. I think the first step in the solution, like me, the first steps, is to sit there, look it in the mirror, and let it hit you. Let it hit you. Let it in. We are failing. We are losing this battle, and we're not going to win by repeating what we've been doing. And one of the things we've been doing is relying on the idea that the federal government is actually there to help us. How many of you today, to this day, have looked at Representative Tom McClintock for solutions? I think Tom's a great guy, so it doesn't unlawful. What do you think the chances of getting real legislation are through that House? 0. Both parties are governed by the same international banking elites who have a different vision for the future of the world. And they're not going to go away. We're not going to win this battle. We're not going to win it if we allow them to take the power of big government, big money, top-down planning, and go attack Joe the farmer, or Mary, who's raising her lambs, or, the forester. It's big government attacking us on an individual basis, and we're losing. The people, in my opinion, government at all levels is rotted, and the people are going to have to be in charge. And that means that we've got to change our viewpoint. And for those of you who have heard me before, I did this message over and over again. We tend to think of politics like we think of television or football games. We elect a sheriff, we elect 5 supervisors, And we watch them and want them to run the ball for us. While we sit in the bleachers, eating popcorn and drinking drinks, or more specifically, we watch Dancing with the Stars, a football game. And ain't gonna work. Continuation of that approach will bring you the same outcome that we're already hitting critics. You have to get off the bleachers and down onto the field. Working with representatives, pushing them when needed, supporting them when needed, replacing them when needed. The federal America is an all-volunteer movement. There's no money in this. And it's basically supported, there's no organization either. It's supported by people and organizations and representatives decide that this program makes sense. It consists of education, strategy, tactics, training, and organizing. It's completely bottoms up and grassroots. We're organizing by county. It's nonpartisan. We believe in going on the offense and stop being so much of the defense. And then we have to focus on root causes. And I think after 3 years, a lot of the Tea Party types and other people are beginning to realize that they've been focusing on symptoms. There's deeper and deeper and deeper levels of understanding. And after studying the world now for almost 3 decades, I think I understand it better than most people I have met. We continue to fight the wrong battles. We get hit from 1,000 directions. We try to respond to 1,000 directions. How many emails do I get? Oh my God, SBXX is being voted on tomorrow. Quick, jump on the email, jump on the fax machine, call your senator, the congressman. It ain't work. We've got to pick the ones that really count. And to do that, we have to understand the real nature of the world. Our current efforts are to take on Neo-Environmentalism head on. We are deeply engaged in the fires and total listing, not only because it's an important battle to fight because it's so big, but it's also a strategic one that we can use for basically mobilizing and training purposes. We want to reopen the forests and start responsible management. Probably the most direct path for counties on this part in the forest parts of California to getting back to financial prosperity, getting the agriculture back, is to get your forest properly managed. You get the income, you get the water, you reduce the fires, you get the tourism. Before this is a constitutional county concept, which was pretty broad and deep, and it's up, we won't talk about the whole concept, we'll talk about part of it today. And finally, you have to take control of your local government. Because here's the choice. We either restore local government, or we're going to suffer global governments. There's nothing in between. Either the world elite will control us all, or we will control our counties. And what I'm trying to tell everybody to do is stop thinking about being the national leader of this, the national leader of that. Keep on focusing your county. Get control of your county back. In terms of taking on the Endangered Species Act, the education, which I began tonight, the counties have to begin to use county money. I think it's this idea that somehow Joe or Mary has to defend themselves with their own pocketbook is a losing cause. We have to realize their fight for their property and rights is actually the county's fight. And taking on endangered species listing doesn't run. I have proposed to all the counties that begin to hire on a permanent basis people who will begin to protect you and share the cost across multiple counties. Frogs and toads, we're in the midst of that right now. The new deadline is November 18th, in which we have to respond. And there are going to be 2 hearings. So we need to prepare for the hearings, we need to prepare our final responses, we need to do every county. Your county has not filed a response. And if your county does not file commentary, then you have no standing in the future. And what I've seen them prepare in response to our submission is nonsense. I reject it. It needs to be done at this point in time. Long term, we need to begin to have the counties to fight back on a permanent basis, and like a permanent shield. There are going to be 2 training classes coming up October 24th and 26th. This is only for the dedicated, limited to 40 or less people per class. These are 6-hour training courses, so if you're interested in actually writing effective commentary and understanding the details, and you're going to do something with that knowledge, this training is for you. We want them to reopen for us, so we have told and submitted draft resolutions to every one of those 14 counties. First, we want you to own up to the fact that we're in a state of emergency. I'm not talking about the Rim Fire. We are in a state of emergency, period. We want that acknowledged. And then secondarily, we want them to authorize and direct the sheriff to start reopening the roads and begin to process a one guided by true science to do a proper fitting and managing those forests, starting with the ones that are the greatest fire risk to the public health and safety and welfare. Pilot program, make it a success, expand it. Your county has the authority, which also means it has the duty to defend your health, safety, and welfare. It's not there to defend spotted owls. It's not there to defend frogs and toads. It's not there to implement federal legislation. It's there for you. Constitutional county. Part of that is to affirm. Notice I don't say we have to enact legislation because it's already there. Affirm and restore the Constitution. And it starts with education. I'm going to give you a little part that this has to do with what's relevant to land. The Constitution is a declaration, it's not an agreement. We, the people, decided that we would create a central body where the states come together to work out matters of mutual interest. And in that, the people are sovereigns. This is unique in all nations. The people are the sovereigns. It was not a contract or something that the federal government had decided to say, we agree. No, it is the terms and conditions under which they take office. It establishes a federation of states to work together on limited enumerated purposes, and essentially is an organization chart with job description. Article 1 is the legislative, and this is the one that establishes the powers and limitations of this federal government. Article 2 and 3 are there basically for the executive and the judicial to enforce that legislation, but the powers are actually in Article 1. And the Bill of Rights affirm these limitations. In this government, the states are sovereign countries. The word state is synonymous with nation, is synonymous with country. California is a country. Montana is a country. Maryland is a country that have voluntarily agreed to work together on items of mutual interest through a Congress, a place where people come and talk about issues of common purpose. But our states are acting like counties. Central government is a federation. It is not a nation. It is the United States of America are, not the United States of America is. And I think that the corrosive thing begins right here. The thing that we normally start out every meeting, something I've said for my entire life, heartfelt and believed. I now believe this is a prison bill. Let me read you Mackenzie's Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of these United States and to the republic for which it stands, one federation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. We have been saying that pledge our entire lives to the point that we believe the federal government is supreme and that everything is accounted underneath that jurisdiction. That is not true. And I further suggest that we have the flag without a flinch. Let's talk about jurisdiction. We're going to start with jurisdiction of public lands, and then we're going to talk about jurisdiction over private lands. This discussion is really confused. People talk about the federal lands, the national forests, and so forth. Let's break down into 4 different roles. Who owns the land? Trustee, legislative authority, and jurisdiction. Keep those four in mind, because when you get into these discussions, people are really muddled in our thinking because we're not clear on all these differences. Who's the owners of the public land? None of these lands belong to the federal government. They don't belong to the state governments either, by the way. The trustee over the lands that have not been converted to private property yet is the federal government. It is a trustee. It is not an owner. Legislative authority is the term defined by the Constitution, and jurisdiction follows legislative authority. Now, I'm about to get you down to one of the most fundamental perversions our country has ever been through. It's buried in this little thing that people don't know too much about. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. It defines where the federal government has exclusive legislative authority. Exclusive. The states have no jurisdiction. And what it boils down to is they have the ability to, states with their approval, the states would cede 10 square miles to form a seat of government. And then central government have the ability to purchase lands from states with the state's consent for enumerated purposes. These enumerated purposes are probably the most important thing of the enumerations that we have. And what are those enumerated purposes? For the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other naval buildings. That's it. That's it. Under Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, it talks about territories and possessions. The territories have been converted into states. The only thing that's left over is Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, and American Samoa. I'm going to call that the federal zone. Now, I'm going to go off the presentation for a moment and tell you how profound this corruption is. That particular clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, where they have exclusive legislative authority, I'll tell you what the federal courts have interpreted this to mean and reinforced for over 100 years. It is that area, that 10 square miles, wherever the federal government has exclusive authority, is not bound by the Constitution. Because they have exclusive legislative authority. In other words, we write a constitution to create the central government, and they're saying they're not bound by an individual. This is the truth. I can show you court decision after court decision reaffirming this. And under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which most people are not aware of, I covered in one of my videos, the 13th was the free the slaves. The 14th has 5 clauses in it, one of which creates this idea of a national citizen. Up until that point, understand the states are sovereign countries, and the only citizenship you have is in your state, your nation. The federal government at this point says we can create citizens ourselves of the federal zone. And anybody who resides in federal lands is now a federal citizen, and those citizens are not bound by the Constitution, but only by our legislation. That includes all people who work for the federal government. You understand, Houdini is slipping out of the straitjacket through corrupt federal court decisions. Let's come back to the land part of this. Let's assume that's all the rest of lands. That's the federal zone. Washington, D.C., a federal enclave is also a small piece of the land purchased by the consent of the states for the building beneath the buildings for security purposes, and the possessions of territories. That's it. The laws that are passed under this federal zone are called municipal laws, as versus international law. Municipal laws only are binding in that particular jurisdiction and nowhere else. Laws that California does for California are municipal laws. The laws that the federal government does for the federal zone are municipal laws. The federal government therefore wears two hats. It passes general laws applicable to all of us under the Constitution, and it's passing municipal laws that are only binding the people that fall within the federal zone. And they call them both the United States. The United States has three definitions. The 50 sovereign nations, the federal zone is called the United States, and the combination is called the United States. And what they do when they write code is they're saying this is a law for the United States and not defined to be for the federal zone. I would contend to you that the Endangered Species Act and the Air Act to be one of our municipal law. Now, returning to what the founding fathers pursued. Recall that the humanity had been in centuries of slavery and feudalism. And they recognized that as long as the land that you're living on is of somebody else, you're their servant. Public lands where those had not yet been designated as private. These belong to the people. Private property belongs to individuals. But all this land either belongs to people collectively or to people individually. Federal legislation does not apply to sovereigns, which we are, to sovereign states, which California is, or to sovereign state lands. The federal municipal law does not apply. Furthermore, federal purchases of public lands from the state of California, the non-enumerated purposes, from the Center for Biological Diversity or any other organization, or for individuals, John Doe, who says, I'm going to sell my land to the federal government, are unconstitutional. There is no provision for the transfer of public property to federal ownership. And that's what it should be. Recall that we were engaged in the whole concept that a free people, to be a free man, requires a freehold. And our government then went about the process of creating free land freeholds, 20 acres and more, because they were tied to the idea of liberty. What's been happening through deception is a reversal, which follows the Marxist doctrine, is the abolition of private property and private rights. Furthermore, they're unconstitutional, even if the state of California consents. Now, as if the interpretation of the Constitution were not sufficient, we go to the 1962 Eisenhower report, a report that was issued at the request of President Eisenhower. He requested every federal agency itemize every single piece of parcel in the United States by county and state that they felt they had some kind of authority over. And then they then classified those. Now, for those of you who are involved in the neighboring acts and statehood, this is long after the neighboring acts. The 5 categories. Category 1, exclusive legislative authority, federal. 2, mixed legislative authority with the federal government is supreme. 3 is mixed state and federal, but the state is supreme. And 4 is and I'm going to describe in a moment, proprietorial interest only. And category 5 is middle up, miscellaneous. Category 4 is what I want to direct your attention to, because this is the definition according to the government, the highest chief executive officer in the land. The federal government has declared some right or title to an area in the state but has not obtained any measure of the state's authority over the area. 95% of those lands that we're calling federal lands are in Category 4, meaning the state as the jurisdiction, not the federal government. Thus, states and counties have jurisdiction over so-called national forests. They're not national forests, they are state forests, they are county forests. They have the authority and the duty to defend the health, safety, and welfare of their constituents and whatever. Over private property. I've already talked about the conversion of land into private property, and this was done through a thing called land patent. The federal government cleared title of all these lands and then gave you ownership of land under certain conditions to yours, to be yours, and that's called land patent. All private property, including your farms, your ranches, your homes, if it's private property, has in its history a land patent signed by the President of the United States at the time. Going back to our model then, here's what this country was based upon, is the idea of all lands belonging to the sovereigns, the people, and a process for taking those public lands and turning them into private property, free of any debt. There are 20 acres in the middle. All you had to do was work it for 5 years and show that you could be productive of use of that land in a mineral rate into yours. This is a sample land patent. This one happens to be signed by President William McKinley in 1901. This is a real land patent. This language appears in almost every land patent. Now, know ye that there was therefore granted by the United States under the said person the tract of land above described and marked out in paper to have and to hold the said tract of land with the appurtenance thereof unto the said person and to his heirs and assigns forever, subject to, and they might then reference the Homestead Act or something of that nature. The process for doing this is the federal government had the states clear title. That was the enabling act. The states had to say, we disclaim we don't have title. We want to clean up the title. The federal government doesn't have title either, but it has those treaties under which land is obtained on behalf of the people. So when that was signed, that land was given to private property forever. So here's land. The states have cleared title, thus they're not going to change title. The federal government has been granted title to an individual forever. And the people are sovereign under whom all land belongs. So does either the state or the federal government have the right of eminent domain? Isn't that what's going on? The federal government is saying, first off, we're going to control all those pieces of land that have not yet been converted to private property, those public lands. Isn't that what they're saying, is they have the authority to extend their authority beyond constitutional constraints, and then, as we saw in the case of Missouri and Arkansas, to extend that to private property? In other words, they're saying they have jurisdiction wherever the air blows, water flows, grass grows, and the animals run. It's federal. They have written the new Constitution of the United States. Have they not? This is the process that we have to follow. I call this not, a lot of people like to say a revolution. It's not. It's a restoration. We need to restore and affirm the basis of this government's formula. Now here's some court procedures. In the United States, sovereignty resides in the people who act through the organs established by the Constitution. The Congress cannot invoke the sovereign power of the people to override their will, as thus declared. Within any state of this union, the preservation of the peace and the protection of person and property are the functions of the state government. The states. That's their function. And if you look at the California Constitution, you'll say it actually says it's there to protect their property. The federal government then goes on to say, and these functions are not part of the primary duty, at least of the nation. In other words, the federal government isn't there to protect your land or your person. The laws of Congress in respect to these matters do not extend into the territorial limits of the states, but have force only in the District of Columbia and other places that are within the exclusive jurisdiction of the national government. In other words, municipal law, the federalism. The United States never held any municipal sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of sale in and to the territory of which Alabama, this would have to be a situation of Alabama, or any of the new states were formed, except for temporary purposes and to execute the trust created. The canon of constructionists teaches us that legislation of Congress, unless a contrary intent appears, is meant to apply only within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. In other words, we're to construe these laws first and foremost as being municipal laws that apply only to the federal zone. All legislation is prima facie territorial. Legislation is presumptively territorial and confine the limits over which the lawmaking power has jurisdiction. Now, I skipped one critical thing I want to understand. The word jurisdiction. And we misunderstand this word. The Constitution doesn't actually define it. Once challenged, Constitution jurisdiction cannot be assumed. It must be proved to exist. And another decision, jurisdiction once challenged cannot be assumed and must be decided. Where Congress exceeds its authority to look to the states, therefore, the departure from the constitutional plan cannot be ratified by the consent of California. The constitutional authority cannot be expanded by the consent of the California State Legislature, whose domain is thereby narrowed. California State cannot give these lands to the federal government, except for by sale and for limited purposes. Now I contend that there's four main themes that are occurring in the movement today. And I'm going to put three of them in column A. This is the statement, the transfer of, quote, federal lands to the states. This is what Utah and really other states are beginning to evaluate. The second is what Siskiyou County is starting to lead as those charged. It's not really truly secession. I think separation is more accurate word, and coordination all affairs from there. The fourth one I'm going to put in column A is jurisdiction. And why do I put them in column A and column B? Because everything in column A has one thing in common. They require approval of the federal government. And I think that once you conclude that the federal government is not the solution but the problem, then I believe that the jurisdiction is the logical way to go, because it requires nothing other than your elected representatives to stand up to the Constitution. You could have your forest roads be open in 30 days. So I was proposing a unified strategy for the movement. You take state separation, coordination, all of them have separate champions. I believe that all of them have to take a look at jurisdiction. And once they realize what jurisdiction is all about, I believe that they discover that that solves most of what they're trying to accomplish through the other means. So let's hold this back. Our view is the people who are up here, we send our county property taxes and our roads, and the county does two things. Government is responsible for policy and enforcement of policy. That's what government does, right? Here's what's really going on. What you have to lie, and there's the county, your property taxes do not stay in your county. Are you aware of that? They go to the state. That's a federal decision that says that that's unlawful for you to take money. They go to the state. The state then sends them back with conditions on them. Grants for specific programs, which is why the grant managers are sometimes the most important position in their county governments. And what's happening is the policy is coming from straight top down, and the county then is just doing enforcement. The two roles have already been split. Regional plans are a form of that because they're predetermining what land uses can be before we even buy their properties. Now this is all a repeat of what happened in 1913, which is the Revolution, 16th, 17th Amendment Federal Reserve Act. 16th Amendment allegedly created a federal income tax, which bypasses the states, bypasses the constitutional requirements, and sends money out to the federal government. Other people like to get into this, like the United Nations. Now, knowing what I know about history and it's being repeated, I can tell you this, is the United Nations eventually will want a direct tax. They cannot continue to survive depending on one Congress after the other. And what have they done? The bankers have created an international transaction tax. A percentage of international transaction tax now goes directly to the funds of the United Nations, bypassing the federal government. It's the same strategy just being implemented over. Who else gets in on this? Regional planning governments. They don't have any constitutional authority, but they're being enacted. The whole idea is the stakeholders outside your community have some kind of say in what happens in your community, in the suicide policies, and things like the Service Employee International Union, which is basically telling your government people it's now a conflict of interest. This is called governance. That's why you're not being listened to. Because your local government has been starved of its tax funds and has to go find the money, and the money finds its coming with conditions on it. And they don't want to piss off the federal government from exercising jurisdiction for fear they lose some of the government funding. This is the battle. And the outcome of this battle is very clear from the first part of this presentation. All of those essentially amount to survey planning. Behind them, ultimately, and I'm not going to go and explain that, but I just pop it in there to complete the picture. These are international bankers and their ability to create money out of thin air and then tax you and put tax burdens on you is the mechanism of finance holes. Central planning bodies are known, the word for that is Soviets. Now, one of the founders of Greenpeace, I think, had an appropriate terminology about the environmentalists. Green on the outside, and red on the inside. Here's the reality. The state and federal government have stolen the county money. Then they're blackmailing the counties into doing what they want them to do, usually expanding beyond their constitutional authority. Well, your county officials accept that money. They are your representatives, are they not? Anybody here is a broker or a realtor? Agency law is a very powerful law. When you choose to represent somebody, that really means something. You owe them their highest loyalty. When you breach that, when they take that money and they basically are pursuing agendas that are not supporting you, it's a breach of fiduciary duty. It's a conflict of interest. Self-dealing. When they refuse to take action on force that are known to be in fire hazard, that's negligence. When they enable the government, buy into this idea that the federal government has more authority than it does, it's illegal. When they transfer to regional governments, it's illegal to transfer authority. If you hire an agent, they can't just assign that agency to somebody else. And when they buy into this idea of the expansion of federal authority by basically taking the money, it's a conspiracy to oppress. capital accounts fit in here, and I'm just going to briefly talk about these. This is actually an independent auditor's report done for Lincoln County and Montana, where it was originally, population of 10 to 15,000 people for 2000, fiscal year 2010, I assume, ending June 2011. The balance sheet shows a statement of net assets of $48.6 million. If you go further into the report to the notes, you find this thing, you find this table, and you find this number right here. And what that table says is security investment type, and the total is $2.4 billion. Somehow those property taxes are slushing around between your county, the state, and the federal government to the tune of $2.4 billion in a county of 15,000 people. We're talking about $250 million for man, woman, and child, or if you actually put in terms of taxpayers, about $1 million for taxpayers floating around somewhere around there. I'd say that's a good thing for a grand jury to investigate. But constitutional counties, as I've talked about before, I think is part of the solution. And obviously part of that is to train people and then elect the people who understand this. I think this is not normal times, and what we have to elect for people who are patriots and not administrators. So what do we do? First off, we need to support the defendant movement. For the first time, there was a real opportunity to unite, and unite around something that's a core, real problem, not symptoms of problems. From that beginning in 1 week, we've gone up and down the counties, all down to Fresno County. Kayla Roddenberry is a team leader, and Fresno County, she's here. Chuck, I don't know if you're here. Yeah. Adam's here, Chuck Chatrone's here. We've gone up and down, meticulously developed groups of citizens in each one of these counties to understand the information that we have. Not just this, but more. And I'm excited to tell you that we're expanding around the counties now, around Fresno. I gave a presentation up at Grants Pass a couple weekends ago, and that team is now going to take that throughout the state of Oregon. And my quote vacation to Montana turned into 1,500 miles of driving in order to meet and present to at least 2 dozen different groups, including state legislators, the DRA concept, and they're moving on this very quickly. We have the opportunity to move on this thing simultaneously across those areas, and I already have getting links in Idaho and Utah. You can contribute. I ask before you leave the room, you consider dropping $20, $50, $100 if you can in the pot. Not only cover the room expenses, but just the general expenses to get included. If we don't already have your name and email address, please make sure that we have it before you leave. Study the Defendable America website, and if you're inclined to get involved really deeply into the issue of writing commentary on the Native Species Acts, then go ahead and take the training by all means. I would encourage each and every one of you now. You've got a whole strategy here. It's your decision now. I can only give you information. It's up to you to fight for your county. I can't do that for you. If you take the strategy, the education, everything goes with it, and move forward, you need to sit for several weeks until you get what you need. Protect against the frogs and toads, get them to fund the permanent shield against future Native Species Act listings, pass those 2 resolutions that begin opening up the forest, and if they're in the process of doing a general plan, stop it and make sure it doesn't negate everything that your rights. I've driven 8,000 miles in 2 months, and I'm going to probably put another 2,000 miles on in the next 4 weeks, trying to get the message simultaneously to as many places as I can, begin to pursue this and go more. Thank you. And I'll now take questions and answers if you like. And I'd like them to be questions, and I'd like them to be directed to this presentation. I realize there's common core education, there's a lot of other things out there, but I know 6 hours staying out here, to talk about that program before I leave. I want to make sure you have every opportunity to ask me questions about that program.
I have something I'd like to say, and I don't know if you're aware of it.
Can everybody hear okay?
Siskiyou County and Modoc County, 80% of those people in those counties have voted for succession from Sacramento. Redding County and Butte County are working on it. And the petition for this county to separate from Sacramento is going to go out next week. What do you have to say?
I love Mark Baird. I think he's a tremendous individual. I support him wholeheartedly. There is no way that California is going to let you walk away with the natural resources.
And we could try.
You can try, but I would suggest to you that the primary benefit that will come out of this program is to get your message out to the world at large. I think the message that's going out is wrong. I think you have to position a message that appeals to people like San Francisco Bay Liberals or whatever, to have to be able to understand the impact of them. You know, crying about your loss of property rights does not motivate somebody in the justice today. So the message has to be positioned in a way that resonates. And I think food quality, the shutdown of recreation, those kind of things do resonate. I think the message has to be packaged to perform the function which I think you will get, which is get an opportunity to put the message out fairly broadly.
Well, I understand that it probably won't happen because I understand that there's a law in Sacramento that says no county can succeed from Sacramento unless the rest of the counties agree. But I look at it as a form of protest against Sacramento.
And I think the extent to which it's used for PR purposes is great. But if you want to actually begin to save your county, I suggest you look very strongly at exercising jurisdiction and working with your boards to get them to jump on board.
Gary?
Oh, no, I just want to ask you a question. I'd like to know, do you have a format of a letter that we can write to the counties to let them know that we want to get on board this as soon as possible and get something done?
Yes, the answer is actually what I kind of learned is that you have to translate this because a lot of people, I went and visited 22 congressmen in Washington, D.C. a long time ago. And I see the same problem here. They're busy, you know, they're trying to, you know, people come up with special requests all day long, they're trying to accommodate that. And don't always understand all these topics in detail in life. And they're rushed. I think you have to write it for them. So what happened is we found out that the project was listening to the impact of the county, so we jumped on it immediately. We came up here and held our first meeting was in Auburn, for the town hall. For those of you that came, we raised the flag. We went down to Fresno. We raised the flag at Clovis with Sheriff Margaret Mims. Then I helped Tom Greenbach then jumped on board, and I helped him to schedule his event, and then I think we had Lamont got on board as well. I personally said, because the counties were moving too slowly, you have a federal government gave us 90 days response. We'd already blown 30 days because we weren't watching the Federal Register every day. So by the time we jumped on it, we put together talking points. So you have something to talk about, analyze this thing, put together, create a website, create all this stuff, got out there on the road, another 15, 30 days ago. The county decision-making process on this is very slow. First, they have to be convinced, they have to weigh it, then there's a 10-day public notification, then you have a public hearing, and then you have another board session that actually vote on something. The bottom line is there were no chances of meeting the August deadline. Furthermore, we asked them for money to contribute a couple $1,000 so we could hire an expert to write commentary for the counties. Not a single county took us up on that. So then what we did is myself and 4 organizations who are working together put together a few $1,000s. And we paid to have a professional commentary written not only from the perspective of our organization, but from the perspective of the county. We made that available to the counties free. Your county did not take it up, they did not do anything with that. Free. This is my profession. If your county does not do this, you have no standing. You've lost. Okay? That's where we stand. The next deadline is November 18th. That information was submitted to your county. Finally, the government is saying it's too complicated, simplify it. So one day in our hotel will go to simplified version. They have rejected that version and came back with one page, but I think it's totally unsatisfactory and to be rejected. I think it's embarrassing that the county would even take that position. Essentially, it's a non-answer, not satisfactory. They are now in the process of a path to give you no representation of this matter. You will lose all that land. Furthermore, we wrote resolutions for them. We wrote a resolution to go ahead and request an extension, so it will move from August, something later. We finally did get an extension November 18th. I don't recall the county filed that. We also, but it was too late now. And we also requested the county submit a request for a hearing and enforce that. The federal government likes to do the following. Yeah, 15 counties say, oh, we're going to have a hearing over in San Francisco. What kind of public input is it? Let me finish.
Okay.
What kind of public input is that? Right? They finally came back and they said they're going to do it in 2 places. I don't think your county ever submitted that request. You can go to the Federal Medical website. There's a page called Jurisprudence, and there's a scorecard. You go down there and look at every county, you can see exactly what they did. You can click on it, see the actual document that's been filed. Right? So, a few counties did, and so we have 2 hearings planned, they're already scheduled, but guess what? They're not going to do one in every county. I think every county has to stand up for its jurisdiction. Honestly, you will have one in my county, because you can't disrespect my jurisdiction, but we're going to control the meetings, they have the right to do so. And we'll tell you what we're going to do. That's where we need to get to in the constitutional county. So now on the closing days, commentary has to be submitted. There are 2 separate proposals, and there will be a third. There's been a lot of confusion, people don't understand this. There was a proposal, that's for the listing. The second one is for the designated habitat. Both of those are released at the same time. You have to respond to them both. The A and B. If you put down on your submission, I only put docket number A, and you sit there and talk about anything you want. We want the listing, and by the way, we think this is a wrong habitat, and by the way, you have no economic analysis, and guess what? B and C don't matter, it's thrown out. It's not relevant to the topic. You must either submit one for A, and second for B, or put a document in both documents, A and B, and then write something that's relevant and has legal weight. You do that. What I saw has no legal weight.
Well, what I wanted to say was, I said it here at a board meeting, and we tried to get a letter drafted, me and him, and we put up a pretty good argument that day. They basically wanted a economy impact, which would extend it. And they also told us, which by the information I got from you today, we were told that they could file it at any time.
Not true. Had there not been an extension, you would have already lost your rights. You cannot. There's a lot of misperception. And the federal agents will actually lead you into making those misinterpretations.
Right.
But when it comes to the court, if there's a visit to the court, the first thing you guys says is, did you file on time? Oh, you have no standing in court. Your county has no standing. All 10, 12,000 people have no standing.
Well, as the government attempted, they let them drag things out over little bits of bureaucracy here and there, where after a while, they don't give a damn.
You have, at this point, available to you, and it's on the website, and I think as far as the exact wording of what we originally proposed would be tailored to the county, many has. You have both board resolutions to pass the emergency resolution and the resolution to open up the forest. I mean, my God, you just went through the fire. This isn't due to global warming. Right. It isn't doing frogs and toads. It's due to the fact there's too much fuel and too little space. And so that resolution already has been before you. There was already a full commentary that cost us several $1,000s available for free to your county to just go ahead and submit it. Walls in your court.
Kurt, may I interject? I did submit that state of emergency resolution to the board several weeks ago. I don't know where it went or if it was reviewed or not. As far as requesting an extension and a hearing, 2 of our county supervisors did write a letter. They were not backed by the 3 other members of the board, but they went ahead and submitted that, and they requested a hearing here, and they offered this room. They did hear back from Fish and Wildlife, but they said they weren't going to choose where these hearings or meetings were going to be until after the economic impact
I think
came
they
out.
already announced 2 of those meetings, and they're basically trying to solve, 14 counties and 2. I think one of them rejected out of hand. This is where you got to demand your jurisdiction. This idea that the federal government comes in and throws in all these states in one region. They ignore the political boundaries. They ignore the national sovereignty of our individual states. And they say, we're going to treat you like a region. That whole concept is unconstitutional. You've got to demand it in your county, and I want all 14 counties to have a separate hearing, which is it is legally recorded and published in the Federal Register, so your comments appear.
We have a comment here.
It's required.
You got somebody ahead. You're next.
Okay, usually getting around, Kurt. I have 2 things. One, comment about what I did in my county, and then also I'm asking you to comment about another matter of jurisdiction. You sort of covered this already. Basically, what I did in Madera County was to alert my supervisor and sent links so that he could become educated. And you can go to DRA, Fox and Toads, and go down and see what the Madera County supervisors wrote in their comments. And so my approach to them was what a constitutional county can accomplish when there's industry in the national forest and the taxes that will come to the schools and so forth and so on. And the second thing then is you mentioned regionalism, and could you explain what happened around the regional area of Sacramento with the 5 counties
The
that
Capital Regional Plan, which I, by the way, was contacted, I wrote a response. But the county and the people of the county are not picking up on this. You've got to fight these battles. Here's the issue. They basically said that we're going to put together a regional planning body that's going to plan the economic future of this 5 or 6 counties. And all the people that were in all the physical places in Sacramento County. So essentially, Sacramento County is going to extend its sphere of influence over 5 of your counties. And what they're asking for is their boards to give prior approval to a plan that's not fleshed out, but basically saying we agree with her to come up with and we'll expedite this process.
That sounds like the Senate.
Now, I have a suspicion there's some money floating around this process as well. Okay? It's unconstitutional. Now, some of these regional planning bodies take the following approach. They say, well, we're going to get 9 counties together, and we're all going to agree that we'll create this regional thing, and if five counties or 5 cities vote for it, then the other 4, even if they vote against it, have to go along. They just said that they could sign away the representation of 4 cities or 4 counties. I don't know. If they want to go talk at some central location, fine, we'll talk, but you have to come back to your approval and for your public comment. But they go off, they work on these things for 2 years, they get the top-down directives, they get a lot of money to be for this regional government, they get a lot of money for high-speed rail, they get a lot of money for common core education. And then they don't care what you think until it comes election time. Now those, I'm not referring to all of them by any means. There are some good supervisors. Some just need some guidance, some are on board, and some are on the wrong side of this fence, and they're going to pretty soon be facing some lawsuits. I'm going to encourage people like Colorado here, if you have property damage resulting in negligence, then I suspect you should sue them individually, and it's a civil lawsuit that cannot tap into your DA or the county funds to defend themselves. You know, there has to be accountability.
Hey, Rick.
Could you make a quick comment on the Arizona situation? Yes.
So Apache County was the first success story. Doyle Shanley, who I brought to California 5 times, and yet now bringing him here 2 more times. He'll be giving those 2 6-hour training classes. They basically understood their jurisdiction. Now, the reason that they understood it, Doyle understood it, is not because we're studying the Native Species Act, but because we're trying to understand where the fundamental things go wrong. There's a lot of people like myself that face the question, it's clearly, what's happening is clearly unconstitutional. So either there's some corruption somewhere in the process, either what's happening is unconstitutional, or there's some kind of interpretation that says that what's happening is constitutional. And what I've given you is one of the core hubs of that corruption. Because of that, there was an understanding of jurisdiction and the ability to apply it. They just had the worst fire they ever had, the Wall Fire. There were still a lot of forests that were left that were threatening further destruction to the community. And the sheriff was a Native American Indian who said they stole their lands from them once, we're not going to steal it twice. In that environment, they prepared those 2 resolutions after which these were modeled. And they did, in fact, put down an emergency resolution, and then they did, in fact, authorize the sheriff and reopen up the forest and begin to manage them. And so those 2 resolutions were given to the federal people. And Oklahoma said, basically, we hope you work with us on this, but if you don't, we're going to do it anyway. It's in our jurisdiction. And lo and behold, the federal ranger there actually didn't want to do good things. They were being stymied by lawsuits and all that as well. And they actually joined hands, and they're working together on what you would call a cooperative or a coordination basis. But they're working together and implementing those plans, and very successfully. And that model is now being replicated. There are 6 counties in Utah adopting that model as we speak. That model will now be going off of these 6 counties in Montana and expanding from there. And it's going on in Colorado. And I know that Doyle has, I think, 1 dozen or 2 dozen presentations on the East Coast, from what I understand, in the next few weeks. So it's taking off like wildfire. It's unfortunate that California is not being afraid of this. I hope that some of these counties like Delmore, Nevada County, where we have good constitutional sheriffs, Siskiyou County, would be afraid. I think Rhode Island would be help. But I think that have to move forward on jurisdiction. So anyway, they had a very successful demonstration of exactly what we're talking about today. No lawsuits, moving forward and doing good work.
And what was the date on that? When did that first occur?
I think it started a couple of years ago. I don't remember the exact dates. They've gone from 0 mills to 6 mills. The economy is back on track.
Great. 3 videos on YouTube.
If you go to the Federal American page, you click on there's a jurisdiction link, and you'll read some of what I'm talking about tonight. A sublink will appear for Apache County, and click on that. I had Doyle recorded and filmed at one of our events, so there's both a 12-minute when he presented the panel, as well as a 2.5-hour seminar that he gave, which will appear on that page. You can read and watch the whole thing. We're now taking it to the next level, which is 2 approaches. Defend against these endangered species listings, take it head on, at the same time we're moving forward in jurisdiction.
Question here.
In these counties that have actually asserted their jurisdiction, and what have they done exactly in the practical sense, and what does it cost them in money?
Well, let's take Arizona because it's the only one that has actually stood up so far. It was more joining it, but it was Apache County. Like I said, they did in fact go before. So the sheriff, for example, went out to all those gates that have been closing off, the federal government's been closing off those roads illegally. And they broke the locks, they reopened the gates, and they took a county lock and locked the gate in an open position. And they put a sign out saying, this is county property, if you mess with it, it's a $700 fine. And then they started shipping the crews in. Most of the plans on how to manage the forest are already there. They've been done by some of the good old-timer forest people. I know there's a bunch of them in every county that I've met. And I'm sure that they're here. You just have to dust them off and move forward on it, and that's what they started to do. Under Egypt, there is no money if you sue a county, only if you sue the federal government. That's why there's been no lawsuits.
That's critical. That's critical.
And what happened is the federal government now is working with them. I think there's a contractual relationship between them. Yeah, the federal government, got even prompting now, has republished the maps. Remember how they take the roads off the maps? They disappear? Well, they forced them to get an original map. They have all the roads. They're putting them back on the maps. And now there's actually two seals side by side, federal government and the county. I would still contend that relationship is probably unconstitutional. But the first step is to assert your jurisdiction to open up and be going. The second step is the bigger one, which is to challenge the whole notion of federal participation and come to a final resolution on this that is appropriate to the county, which the county decides works for them.
Well, I agree with that in principle, but the question is if you're not able to step up and do your practical part, like helping to maintain those roads and change the culverts when they need to do all those things, where you're going to be.
They have actually paid for all that, and there was I went to Salt Lake, I went to Park City, Utah in the last 2 weeks, and there was a meeting there tonight where we had over 100 legislators from across, I think it was about 10 states, talking about statehood and this very issue. One of the presentations was the economics of basically taking control of your lands again. And the analysis, which appeared to be pretty thorough, was the bottom line is you do, in fact, come out way ahead. You either have those two paths. You either accept socialism, and in which case I can tell you what that, if you're familiar with the movie The Matrix, you either take the blue pill or red pill. If you take the blue pill, I can tell you what your future looks like. Your TV sets are going to get bigger, and your rooms that you're allowed to live in get smaller. You'll be put into basically human tunnels.
I understand.
And your reality in the world will be based upon that screen. You'll be plugged into whatever they feed you. The other option is you have to take back the original vision this country was founded upon.
I agree with you 100%, but what I want you to tell me is what do I say to my supervisor when I present this concept to him and he says, well, where are we going to get the money to send the road grader to the National Forest when we can't even do the roads we have in our
Okay, so
county?
the answer is, it turns out there's a whole bunch of money that's how they did it, and that's part of the answer. And I'm not the guy there, Doyle is. And the same thing came up with this fellow in Utah that's heading up a charge to get 6 counties on board. I had a great conversation with him, and boom, you got a pocket money this, you got a pocket money this, but there are pocket money this. There are funds already available which should comply with this task. They're basically funds coming from the federal government. They get you up off the ground, and the actual business and so forth you generate that then become self-sustaining.
And where can we?
Actually, the best thing is I have told your supervisors, by the way, I emailed them all, along with these, and I carbon copied everybody in the county that's on my list. So you can see the dialogue. There's no hiding. You can't say I didn't get this. And I have recommended that they specifically hire Derek Cost Consulting from Apache County to defend on this project and to become a permanent barrier. And they're shared that cost over 14 counties. I can't imagine the cost to exceed $1,000 or $2,000 a month if the cost share. I've said that to many supervisors. So I've had some debates. Some say, well, I'm a small county, Fresno's a big county, we got a portion of by sides. And I think, okay, that's right. The bottom line, you're talking about peanuts to defend yourself. So you have the answers to all of those questions. I just don't have them personally on my phone.
Yeah, I was just hearing the gentleman talk about what's been accomplished, so I just raised my hand with 5 fingers showing the 5 sawmills that have opened up in Apache County.
6.
But one thing you could tell about that, but anyway, in the Sierra National Forest Ranger District, we have the stewards of the Sierra National Forest, who are old guys like me that like to ride dirt bikes and ATVs, and we go out in the springtime with our chainsaws and clear through the roads. And there's grant money that comes to us actually from the federal government that pays for our gas mileage to go there. So anyway, there's a lot of creative ways to get it done.
So I think the money thing is another training seminar, so to speak. So, I am out here talking about there's some stuff here that Doyle hasn't seen, and then the disease that he's doing, I haven't seen. But basically, you have to take this in bits and pieces. There's a lot to learn. as you can tell. So learning about jurisdiction, learning about constitution, learning about constitutional counties, learning about, you know, the details of how you implement, where's the money coming from, all that stuff, all that's known. Not all of it's in the format yet for public mass distribution. One of the things that I do at that website is I give you a free encyclopedia. It's free for access, it's free of advertising, and it's free of Google. I do not use Google Analytics, so they're not tracking what you do on my website. It's there waiting for you to discover. And as soon as I have the time, I will get, for example, I'll take that detailed stuff and I'll scan it down, like I do with all the topics, and get it to you.
Question right here, Kat. Oh, I'm sorry, Janet.
Let's not be prejudiced here.
What I'm concerned about is, what I need to know is, if the supervisors did not want to make a decision, what was holding them back? Why did they choose basically inactivity? What can we do to impress upon them that this is their opportunity to stop the invasion of our county by these organizations that want to take over our jurisdiction?
Kay, would you like to answer this question? Kay is probably the quietest, meekest person and so effective. Tell them what you've been doing in Fresno County. You want to do that just at some
We have been attending,
we have just had a lot of meetings, and we took two resolutions to our Board of Supervisors. We thought it would be a slam dunk with the fire danger. No, we're still working on the resolutions that we've met with County Council, we've met with the Public Works and Planning. They brought back, Public Works and Planning brought back a resolution that was nowhere near what we needed it to be. And they thought, oh, we'll just get rid of these people, they're from the mountains. What happened is we went to the board and we said, no, please don't act on these. These would be it would make the situation actually worse. So we are still in meetings.
And Judy, who was one of the county supervisors, who come to Steve Rank. Steve, where are you? Steve Rank right there is the key guy that's been helping us to connect all the dots on forestry, gave a presentation which Judy came. She's one of the county supervisors. And the comment she made was, what happened was the board had said, we want you to go review this with staff. Well, staff never contacted people and didn't work with them, and they came back with a modified version, to which we said, no, hell no. And it was interesting, I guess the comment came, and I wasn't there, but I'm relaying what you told me, I hope this is accurate, that the comment made is you will meet with these people to staff by the time we have our next supervisor meeting, and the resolution that we expect to pass is going to be much closer than the federal American deals. Now, there have been this is the other part of this thing. So, part of it is public education like this. Part of it is going to those board meetings and sitting on this. Join Wendy and her husband Terry. They're sitting there all the time. Go join them. Part of it is taking them off one by one, educating them, getting to know it, and keeping on and doing that to the point that no, it's not going to go away. When we had a meeting in Crayford, we had 1,000 people show up. Only 750 could find parks and get inside the room, but even that was standing room only. We need to get that point here, this county. This is a prelude to what we hope will be a bigger event now with you guys to help to participate to make that happen. That's when this thing started to really shake the home. And we need your name and email addresses and how to contact you, keep in touch, get your work. But that's, so part of it is working away from the public light and talking to them. And the good ones will want to understand and will work with you. Those that brush you off on a consistent basis are probably not with the people. And so I want to make crystal clear that people understand the consequences of that inaction. I want the representatives to be crystal clear of the consequences to them if they don't. These lawsuits I'm talking about are not trivial. When you act outside your jurisdiction as elected representative, you act in the color of law. you're breaking a law, and that's a private lawsuit. You cannot get a district attorney to represent you, you cannot tap into county funds. So, and I want to start class action lawsuits against individuals who are causing property damage as a result of negligence. And I'd like to include Center for Biological Diversity. If a wolf eats a child, I want those people charged with manslaughter. Because they are doing the same thing as if they're giving a gun to somebody and say, go shoot somebody. If they deny you your ability to have health, safety, and welfare, they're obstructing your justice. They're risking your, that's a violation. I think that's a civil damage.
Kia's not taking here enough credit for what she's doing in Fresno County.
I'm one
She's,
person.
she,
700 people came to the meeting.
I can give you an example. Tuesday, she needed to make a presentation to the board, and she needed, somebody besides her needs to be there to not make a presentation, but present some papers. And she got 5 of us to show up. And 2 of us spoke, and the rest of us just sat there. But so you've got to back up the person that's out there talking. Some people have ability to talk, and some people have the ability just to show up.